This week on A Lively Experiment, the House budget released late last week contains a few surprises. We'll tell you what they are. And it's been 40 years since Rhode Island has had a constitutional convention. Will next year be the year?
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazen White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.
Joining us on the panel, URI political science professor Emily Lynch, political contributor and founder of Watchdog RI, Ken Block, and Raymond Bakari, digital content producer for WPRI TV. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Lively. I'm Jim Hummel. The clock is ticking on this year's General Assembly session. Front and center this week, details of the $13.95 billion budget released by the House Finance Committee after months of hearings. That proposal is $250 million more than what Governor McKee proposed in January. And for context, the budget was $9.5 billion just 5 years ago. If you're doing the math, that's a 50% increase. Emily, they're going to talk. We're taping on a Friday. They're going to talk about it, probably pass most of it tonight. Anything stand out to you in the budget as you look at it?
Yes, I think there are a few issues that really stood out to me in thinking about education and how the House included funding for multilingual learners, as well as keeping that core instructional amount within the funding formula. I think that not only education, but housing, transportation, and healthcare are also really important issues that there are key aspects of those two that we could talk about as being as paying attention to see what happens with them today.
Sure. Ken?
What's shocking to me is the size of the budget and whether it's sustainable once all of the extra federal monies disappear, which is probably, this budget's probably the last year that can depend on the federal dollars. So we have a big problem coming into next year's budget. How do we pay for it? Can we keep it at the level that it is? I suspect that we can't, and what are we going to do? What gets cut? $14 billion budget across 1 million people. That's $14,000 per person who lives here. That's an astonishing amount of money, and I don't believe that we have any hope of keeping the spending at that level.
And you remember at the debate that you moderated with Patrick Anderson and Ian Donna, somebody asked Governor McKee when he was running for re-election, when all the COVID money's sifted out, what do you think the budget's going to go back to? I think his answer was $11 or $12 billion. At the time.
Us in Rhode Island media, the first thing we look at whenever it comes to the budget being introduced every year is the size of it. As Ken pointed out, it's at $14 billion with a B, and as you mentioned in the intro, it was barely even $10 billion a few years ago. My colleague Ted Nesi did a great write-up on this, talking about what's in the budget and what's not in. Things I noticed that weren't in was the Citizens Bank tax change that was being pushed forward toward the end before the briefing, and then the state archives, the new state archives building that Secretary Moore is pushing for. Didn't get in there. I noticed there's money for the Washington Bridge reconstruction. RIPTA got the funding it needs to avoid those service cuts. There's the $120 million housing bond that's aimed to be a piece of the puzzle to take on the state's housing crisis, a perennial issue in this state. And then, being a Rick alumnus, I have to point out some Rick things. There's the proposal for money to renovate Whipple Hall for the new Cybersecurity Institute. And I saw, I don't know what the fate of this was in the budget. I didn't see anything on it, but I remember the governor not too long ago put an amendment to extend the Hope Scholarship to, I believe it was 2030.
Sure, because it was going to sunset. The affordable housing is interesting to me because they've allocated already $250 million, but so many stories about that were years away. And so I wonder this extra $120 million. It's a bond, but I wonder if the timing might have been better next year. I don't know.
Well, I think it's important to include funding for an authorization for the public housing developer as a potential way to face the housing crisis in the future, which we'll see what the leaders, what they do. But it gives the state an opportunity to be a progressive leader across the country, and modeling after like that what we see in a county in Maryland. So I mean, there are drawbacks, benefits and drawbacks to this, but I think it will it puts that ability that if they want to move forward, they can. The other thing, when we're thinking about housing, there was a surplus. So Speaker Shekarchi included more than what was originally allocated for housing because of the crisis. And some of that money is going toward town planning, which I think is a great way to think about federalism and how the city and towns need to have some funding in order to plan for what these new housing developments look like across the state.
What else stood out to you?
Well, let's stay on housing for a minute. I think everybody can acknowledge that we have a crisis and there's not enough housing. There's certainly not enough affordable housing. I have a beef that I've talked about before here with the Superman building and the gigantic amount of taxpayer dollars that are being asked to help renovate that building, and part of those renovation dollars are going to yield, in theory, some affordable units. I think that $100 to $150 million in state taxpayer money can be spent on housing in a far more effective way than it can be spent on the Superman building. I think that we should take the building by eminent domain, give it away to a movie producer who will bring it down as part of a movie. They just have to clean it up afterwards. Let's save the taxpayer dollars, put them into something that can really be effective in terms of the number of housing units that we need, and stop this incessant whining for money on the part of a private owner of a building.
You heard it here first. Ken Block, bring it down as part of the movie. I will say, it's been kind of quiet, but they've said, well, are they going to need more money? Just because of are they going to come back because?
Exactly.
Right. So, Raymond?
Another thing I was looking at was the cost of living adjustments for the retired state employees. They're going to be returning for those who retired before 2012, as opposed to when the pension fund reaches 80%, which is part of that 2011 overhaul. There were initial concerns by the state treasurer, James Diossa, about how this would affect the state's borrowing capacity. And then, just looking at the whole issue on the flip side, the retirees argue that the rising inflation, they're hurting and they need these cost of living adjustments. And before this proposal, I think the estimate for when we would get to that 80% was, I think, 2030.
Yeah, let's set the table on that. The legislature told the treasurer to put together a committee because, quite frankly, the retirees before Gina Raimondo, who was the treasurer back in 2012, many of them don't collect Social Security. They were banking on these pensions but the COLAs were unsustainable, Ken. And I know you've looked at the pensions a lot. It seems that they really got the ear of the speaker, the retirees. And I don't know how many there are now. There's 19,000 that this is going to affect. They were arguing before the 80% and whatever needed to kick in, a lot of these people were going to die. They were on $35,000 to $40,000 pensions. But structurally, I wonder in the long run what this is going to do for So what they've done is they've added money back in, but that's going to have a ripple effect in the years ahead.
Yeah. So the study commission that was stood up to address this punted. They really didn't make any firm recommendations on what should or shouldn't be done. The treasurer, who I like personally, hasn't taken a particularly courageous stance on this one way or the other. He was warning about it, then said, well, never mind, go ahead and do it. And what I think a lot of people lose track of is, had these changes not been made more than a decade ago, the pension system would have been potentially bankrupt by this point in time. It was a very necessary thing to do. We're not out of the woods, and I argue that taking action now that endangers the health of the pension plan can send us right back to where we were a decade ago, and that would be a bad outcome for everybody.
It's always so tough because you hear these stories about people who were just getting by and they were promised, should the state live up to its contract. So I see both sides of it.
Oh, definitely. And Nancy Lavin and Kathy Gregg had some great coverage on these topics. And it sounds like it was only a few more years until it was going to kick in again. There are going to be more. They're going to revisit it, more changes. So I know RIPEC came out this week saying they're concerned about the long-term effects of the pension reforms. And I think that it'll be interesting to hear what the House does today and how they discuss, if they focus on this, and just overall that pension reform package of looking at state employees and the ability for some of them in safety jobs to retire early, similar to firefighters and police officers. But then, on the other hand, providing incentives for retirees to continue to work. So it's interesting to look at all the different aspects of this this legislation.
Ken, just to wrap up on your point, there's going to be a state contribution, but that also triggers another local contribution. So that's going to have a trickle-down effect.
Yeah,
the decisions they're making to add it back in.
The amount of liability that we have, money that's owed to both state and local pensions, is crushing when you look at it as a total burden. Just really quickly, in Providence, the pension fund liabilities and the OPEB liabilities, which is health care for retirees, amounts to more than $15,000 per person who lives in Providence right now. It's a crushing burden. We have huge problems, and what the retirees are asking us to do is ignore the problems and focus in on their particular issues, which I get, and they're in a tough spot, but our government has a responsibility to do what's right for the long run. And I think endangering the pensions and putting them on shakier ground at this particular point in time does not serve the public interest at all.
Right. Just a couple of other things. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, there was a flurry of activity last night. What happened up there?
Yeah, so yesterday the Rhode Island Senate voted on several bills. Among those included reforming the state's Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, also known as LEOBOR, and then also passing the Safe Storage Bill, which would require gun owners to lock up their firearms when not being in use. For the LEOBOR, what happened with LEOBOR, that went to the Senate. There was an amendment introduced by State Senator Dawn Oyer to address the concerns about transparency when it came to body-worn camera videos. That amendment passed unanimously, and then after the Senate passed the LEOBOR bill with that amendment, it quickly, like within an hour or two, went right to the House afterward. That passed, so now that's on its way to the governor's desk, and safe storage as well. That passed with these. And then there's a few other bills I'm looking at as we're getting to the end of the session. Among those include the Senate's Health Initiative, which include the Fair Share for Dental Care Act, the bill to increase ADU production, which was one of Speaker Shekarchi's package of bills to address the housing crisis, and then another one introduced by Rep. Serpa and Senator Raptakis to let unaffiliated voters who vote in a primary stay unaffiliated automatically without having to disaffiliate. So there's a lot of bills going on.
Yeah, there's a lot going. We're going to see between now and next week. They're going to try to adjourn, and maybe the week after. The Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, though, is one that everybody's been talking about, and it almost got to the finish line the last couple of years. This year, it looks like it's actually going to happen.
Yeah, I think that's good news. I mean, it just shows that it takes time to get some of this type of legislation through. And as Ray mentioned, there was that final concern about the body cam and the footage, and that was resolved. And that was due to media coverage and advocates speaking out about that. And I believe, we'll see the governor signing that shortly. The other thing that Ray discussed in one of his pieces is the Attendance for Success bill. So I'm really interested to see what happens with that. I think that as this is something that Governor McKee has really discussed in detail and has gone down to DC to showcase what he's done in Rhode Island in improving attendance across the state. And I think the legislators involved have done a great job in outlining the importance of having data on absences, not only like those who are unexcused but excused. I know it sounds like arbitrary, but these are important to pay attention to and to help those students who need interventions, as long as the schools are getting the funding that's needed for those interventions. I believe that's a good thing. And McKee's Learn 365 initiative, which we've talked about before on this, really comes into play here, where you have community organizations, partners that can help with improving attendance. And University of Rhode Island has talked about, or has become a part of this this solution to helping with attendance, where you have the College of Education that has come into the public schools in South Kingstown to help with maintaining relationships with students, to mentor them through mentor tutoring internships. And I've had students in my class, and this is why I'm kind of going on and on about this, but who have been a part of this mentor tutor internship and have discussed in podcasts that they created how this relates to chronic absenteeism and how it can help improve students in going to school when they have mentors that they know will be there in these after-school programs.
And that was a big problem after COVID. The rub on Learn 365 is where's the next round of money going to come from? Because the incentive for them to get involved was the little stick with some money at the end of the line, right?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of municipal spending has its genesis in, okay, we're going to seed this program, but then it's on you as we move on. And a lot of school budgets are under a lot of duress right now. Municipalities struggle with their own budgets right now, so what becomes effectively an unfunded mandate, the General Assembly's never really been careful about that, but they do need to have some care, because there are a lot of mandates that municipalities and school boards have to work under, and at some point it just, with a cap on how much money taxes can be raised by, thankfully, municipal budgets struggle to handle a lot of this new spending that they're required to do.
The last thing I'm going to be looking at is we haven't heard a lot about access to public records reform. There was a lot of discussion early in the session and now, and I haven't really heard much about that. Have you?
Yeah, so we on Newsmakers, my colleagues Ted and Tim, they talked to John Marion, Executive Director of Common Cause Rhode Island, not too long ago, and he said that the bill was still alive. So that was also another bill I listed in the article that Emily is referring to, where I talked about 5 bills to watch with some honorable mentions as the session closed down. So yeah, that one's one to keep an eye on as well. And then one note I wanted to add for the Attendance for Success Act is that it's supported by the Rhode Island Department of Education as well.
Great. Every 10 years, voters in Rhode Island are asked whether they want to have a constitutional convention, and that would open up a whole, they would put together a committee. The last time this happened was 1985, and as I was telling the panel in our little pregame show, we said luminaries such as Link Chafee and Bruce Sunland, think of how long it's been, before anybody knew who they were in that constitutional convention. Ken, they've voted this down, the voters have voted this down 3 times since 1980s. It really comes down. So it's going to be on the ballot again. It really comes down to lobbying, doesn't it? At the end of the day,
it comes down to lobbying.
Interest groups.
It comes down to when we put the question on the ballot, it becomes a campaign, right? If we're going to elect to have a constitutional convention, there has to be an effective political campaign executed to make that happen. In 2014. There was a very effective political campaign against having a constitutional convention and a very ineffective campaign to have one. I believe it's important that we have one. There are fundamental issues in how we govern ourselves that the General Assembly, left to their own devices, will never change.
Oh, let me think. Line item veto. Hey, are you interested in line item veto?
I am a little bit interested in the line item veto, yeah. And there's a whole lot of other issues like that as well. Really important good government issues. Just the way we conduct ourselves at the end of the General Assembly session with this incredible spasm of lawmaking, a $14 billion budget that's publicly known for less than a week before they vote on it. There are fundamental things that we should be doing better than we are right now, and the Constitutional Convention is the way to get it done without needing to try to get the General Assembly to do it.
Have you studied the Constitutional Convention? Not in your classes, but it's an interesting academic pursuit too, is it not?
Yes, and I think something that we want to consider is how is the public being informed about the potential issues? And I know there's some discussion about having, there's a call within the Constitution of having a preparatory commission. So who should be on that preparatory commission? Should it be General Assembly members? Should it be those outside of the General Assembly? And there is a need to raise awareness about the pros and cons of changing the Constitution. What are the key issues, key areas? Line item veto, obviously, is one. Another would be the right to education amendment. I mean, the list could go on and on. We could
Voter initiative. God forbid you would ever have that, right?
And then, speaking of items that could be done, if this constitutional convention were approved, term limits for members of the state legislature and an inspector general's office.
Yeah.
So, there's a lot of things that could happen
but that's maybe why they don't want, it's kind of the legislature has to put it on the ballot. But I remember, so the great argument from 1985, and Pablo Rodriguez talked about this because he was here during that time early in his tenure, was that they were concerned they were going to restrict the right to abortion. Well, actually, when they put it on the ballot, 2/3 of the people said, no, we don't want that. So, you got to trust the voters a little bit, right?
Look, there's zero political chance in Rhode Island that the right to abortion would be restricted under a constitutional convention, because the public support for keeping abortion available is hugely positive. It's like 70-30. So anybody who brings that up as a reason not to have a constitutional convention is just fear-mongering, and they're trying to avoid opening up the powers that be to having some of those powers reined in a little bit if the Constitutional Convention does its job well.
Yeah, I think it does come down to I remember from 10 years ago that there was a lot of money dumped in against, and there were some, I don't know if it was kind of the beginning of the misinformation age. I think there was a lot of confusion, so people were like, well, let's just stay with what we have. So your messaging has to be there, right?
Right, exactly. So we'll see. We don't have that much time left until we see it on the ballot. So we'll see if there are groups that come up and what their messaging is for or against having a convention.
What's your gut say? It just depends on the way the campaign goes. Do you think voters will approve
it depends on the pro-convention side. It's really going to depend on who's quarterbacking it and how effectively they can run the campaign to do it. I believe that the voters can be easily convinced to do this, but the convincing has to happen.
Okay. We have some local races to get to, but let's do outrages and/or kudos first. Mr. Bakari, let's begin with you this week.
I have a kudo. Yesterday,
wow.
The Celtics won Game 1 of the Finals by a convincing margin against the Mavericks, so it's a good time to be a Celtics fan.
Any predictions for the series?
I don't want to give any bold tastes.
Oh, come on, a week for that. Celtics in 5, Celtics in 6.
I want Celtics to win. Maybe 6, 5, probably 6. Maybe Kyrie gets a good game or two. I'm just praying that they just pull it off.
Just to show there's no objectivity in sports reporting, the Globe interviewed the 4 sports reporters for the Globe and then for the ones for the Dallas Morning News. What a surprise. Everybody but Shaughnessy predicted the Celtics in Boston, and everybody predicted the Mavericks. So, Ken, what do you have this week?
Well, I have an outrage. It's about the bridge. And DOT Director Alviti was on the radio this week talking about the procurements to demolish the bridge and build a new one. And what he was discussing, the finer points of what he was talking about, were contrary to what the request for proposals are asking the vendors to do. A very interesting divergence, and it's too detailed to get into in 45 seconds.
Yeah, we've got a couple of minutes, so go ahead and talk about it.
So what it really comes to, there's a ton of risk that the DOT is placing on the vendors in these public procurements to demolish and rebuild the bridge. And the risks are that while the DOT knows what the health of the support structure of that bridge is under the water, because they did that analysis when they closed the bridge, they haven't told any of the vendors what the results of that analysis are. And what they're telling the vendors is, it's your call whether or not those supports can be reused or they have to be rebuilt. So it's on you to bear all that cost and risk. And on top of that, if there are any environmental issues with the river bottom, that's on you as well. And
who's going to want to bid on that?
I can't imagine anybody would want to expose their corporation to that kind of risk unless they're all going to be submitting $750 million bids to cover those cost eventualities.
And why would they want to keep the footings if you're building a brand new bridge that you're going to hope is going to last 100 years?
Can you build a 100-year lasting bridge on top of cement that's already 60 years old?
Well, we know what salt does, right?
I mean, right. I don't think we really can. The lack of transparency with this entire bridge debacle, from the day they closed the bridge down, right through the procurements right now, we haven't had the transparency. The vendors who are supposed to bid on this don't have the transparency that they need. And I believe that we could end up with a 5-6 year window to rebuild this bridge at just a gigantic cost that right now nobody is really talking about. If anybody chooses to bid on this at all, I don't know if anybody will because of the risks that are involved.
All right, I want to get back into that in just a second, but I want to make sure Emily gets in her outrage or kudo. What do you have?
So I have a kudo today. And the kudos goes to Speaker Shekarchi for including some funding for the arts and specifically for the Tamaquag Museum. And this is the Tamaquag Museum is currently in Exeter and moving to URI. And I think this is a really important museum to have and to fund, where students across the state can learn about Indigenous history and culture. I had Silver Moon LaRose, who's the assistant director from Tamaquag Museum, visit my classroom a couple years ago, and the students were astounded then students from Rhode Island and outside of Rhode Island, astounded to hear about the history here in Rhode Island related to Indigenous tribes.
Not only did I not know about the Tamaquag Museum, I had no idea about the funding. You learn something new on Lively every week, so thank you for that. Let's just talk about the Washington Bridge, because we haven't had, what show would be without the Washington Bridge? You know, Raymond, it's been a while since the governor said there was going to be a day of reckoning, and now that seems almost like nobody talks about that anymore.
Yeah, it's definitely one aspect of the conversation that the local media has been looking at, trying to figure out what's going on with that. I'm now driving over the bridge, starting.
And eastbound's a problem, right? Because you're going to East Providence.
Yeah, I mean, even like I have weekend shifts, so like even going there on a weekend, sometimes it's backed up and very, very far backed up. So I have to plan an hour or maybe like 30 minutes to an hour of extra time just to account for that commute. This is going to be one of those issues that we're constantly talking about, like 38 studios at this point.
Yeah, and politically, it's going to probably bleed into the 26 race, right?
Yeah, definitely. This is going to be an ongoing issue, and definitely based on politics as we continue into the gubernatorial race. But I think as for today, when we're looking at like Shekarchi and how he allocated funding for the bridge, that was a smart move to use the fiscal recovery funds, capital plan funds for our portion, and we'll see, we're waiting for the federal funds to kick in.
We got about a minute left. You've done an awful lot of deep dive. What should the viewers know from what you've looked at over the last month in 50 seconds?
Yeah, so it's not just my research. I have talked to a lot of engineers who have worked for the DOT, who work for vendors to the DOT, and what I'm hearing across the board is that the current procurements fall far short of what's needed for these vendors to confidently bid the job. There's a lot of unknowns with it. The DOT has not covered itself in glory in terms of maintaining the bridge, not being aware that the bridge was in serious danger of immediately falling down. And Governor McKee has really exposed himself to a lot of political peril because he has really failed the voters in this state in transparency, in accountability, and I think that it's going to be probably his biggest problem in 2026.
Okay. All right, folks. That is all the time we have. We appreciate you spending your week with us, part of your week. Ken and Rain, good to see you back. And Emily, come back here next week. We'll know a lot more about the beginning of the end of the General Assembly session. We'll have it all covered for you with a full analysis. We hope you have a great weekend and come back next week as the Lively Experiment continues.
A Lively Experiment is generously underwritten by...
Hi, I'm John Hazen White Jr. For over 30 years, A Lively Experiment has provided insight and analysis of the political issues that face Rhode Islanders. I'm a proud supporter of this great program and Rhode Island PBS.